The hum of the airplane engines was a steady presence, a comforting reminder of the journey's progress. David Carter settled into his seat, his tall frame folded with practiced ease into the narrow space. It wasn't his first flight, not by a long shot. But this one felt different. The passengers around him were a typical mix for a transcontinental flight: business travelers in crisp suits typing furiously on laptops, families whispering instructions to their children, and retirees with novels perched on their laps. David took in the scene with quiet detachment. He had seen it all before, from a different perspective, one only visible to those who wore the uniform and carried the responsibility of thousands of lives at 35,000 feet. He wasn't wearing that uniform today. Today, he was just another passenger in a faded sweater and jeans, blending in, or so he hoped. A flight attendant moved purposefully down the aisle, her professional smile polite but distant. When her eyes briefly met David's, there was the slightest hesitation. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but he caught it. He always did. Years in the cockpit hadn't dulled his awareness of how people looked at him, at his skin before anything else. He let it go. Like always, it wasn't worth the energy. Especially now. As the plane climbed steadily into the sky, David leaned back and closed his eyes. The rhythm of travel was familiar, soothing even. The safety announcements, the shuffling of overhead bins, the muffled coughs and laughter of strangers. It was the sound of life continuing, indifferent to individual worries or quiet tensions. But beneath the surface, there was always something simmering. That had been his experience. At least, people didn't mean harm. Not usually. Their judgments came from a place they didn't even recognize, assumptions passed down like heirlooms, polished and normalized over generations. David had learned to live with it, to exist in the spaces between their expectations and his reality. The flight attendant passed by again, her tray laden with small cups of soda and water. When she reached his row, her smile tightened, as if bracing for something. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone crisp but neutral. "Water, please," David replied, his voice steady. He made a point of keeping it light, non-threatening. It was a skill he had perfected over the years, offering reassurance where none should have been needed. She handed him the cup without a word and moved on, her focus already shifting to the next passenger. David took a sip and glanced out the window. The clouds below were an endless expanse of white, serene and indifferent. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about the life he had left on the ground. The early mornings at the airport, the camaraderie of the flight crew, the quiet pride of guiding a plane through turbulent skies. It was a life that demanded precision, discipline, and trust, qualities he had cultivated with care. But today, he was just David, the man in seat 18A. The irony wasn't lost on him. The person who would ordinarily be in the cockpit, ensuring the safety of everyone on board, now sat as a silent observer, his expertise hidden beneath a casual demeanor. No one here knew who he was, and he preferred it that way. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign dinged off, David let out a slow breath. It was just another flight, another chance to watch the world from a distance, to be part of it without truly belonging. He leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes, the faint hum of the engines lulling him into a light doze. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if today would be different, or if it would be the same quiet balancing act he had mastered long ago. The thought drifted away as the clouds carried the plane forward, indifferent to the man who sat among them. The flight had settled into its usual rhythm. The passengers, having adjusted to the hum of the engines and the faint vibration of the cabin, were now absorbed in their distractions: books, movies, light conversations. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisle with practiced efficiency, their footsteps nearly silent against the carpeted floor. David Carter sat quietly, his gaze shifting between the window and the paperback novel in his hands. He wasn't reading so much as holding the book, a habit he had developed to keep others at ease. It made him appear approachable without inviting unnecessary attention. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the in-flight service. David let his gaze wander, noting the details without judgment. A young woman a few rows ahead whispered soothing words to a restless toddler. An older man adjusted his hearing aid, leaning closer to his wife as she gestured toward a crossword puzzle. It was an ordinary flight, unremarkable in every way until the faint sound of commotion broke through the hum. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, with a muffled gasp from somewhere near the middle of the cabin. David's ears picked it up instinctively, the way they always did. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the rows ahead. A flight attendant had stopped abruptly, her tray clinking as she set it on an empty seat. Then came the voice, sharp and edged with alarm. "Is there a doctor on board?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and the atmosphere shifted. David's grip on the book tightened as he watched a young flight attendant hover over an elderly man slumped in his seat. His face was pale, almost ashen, and his chest barely moved. Beside him, a woman, his wife, David assumed, shook his arm gently, her voice cracking with worry. "I think he's stopped breathing," the woman said, her words slicing through the air like a cold wind. David felt the familiar pull, that quiet instinct honed by years of training. He had seen situations like this before, though usually from the vantage point of the cockpit, coordinating assistance through a radio. Here, he was just another passenger, a man whose credentials were invisible to everyone around him. A passenger seated across the aisle stood up. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice steady but urgent. She leaned over the elderly man, checking his pulse and tilting his head back slightly. David watched, his instincts firing. The nurse was competent, but she was working alone. And every second mattered. He could see the small signs, the shallow rise of the man's chest, the flutter of his eyelids that suggested time was slipping away. Still, he hesitated. He had learned the hard way that stepping forward often brought more questions than solutions. People didn't see a pilot when they looked at him. They saw a man who didn't fit their assumptions. A man who had to prove himself in ways others didn't. Even now, as the urgency of the situation grew, he could feel the weight of their unspoken judgments. The flight attendant turned, her gaze darting across the cabin. "Does anyone else have medical training?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. David set his book down and stood. His movements were deliberate, calm. The nurse glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm trained in emergency response," he said simply. He avoided saying more, knowing from experience that too much explanation could complicate things. "I can help." For a moment, the flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicked over him, searching for something. What, exactly? He couldn't say. Authority? Confidence? Validation? Whatever it was, her expression didn't soften. "It's fine," the nurse interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. "If he knows what he's doing. We need the help." The flight attendant stepped back, but her posture was stiff, her reluctance unmistakable. David ignored it. He had a job to do, and the man's life took precedence over everything else. Kneeling beside the seat, he assessed the situation quickly. The man's breathing was faint, his pulse irregular. David's voice was calm but firm as he gave instructions to the nurse, asking her to retrieve the medical kit while he repositioned the man to improve airflow. The passengers watched in silence, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. David felt their stares but didn't acknowledge them. This wasn't about proving himself to them. It never had been. It was about saving a life, even if the weight of their assumptions pressed against him like an invisible force. Above all, it was about doing what he knew was right, because sometimes, in the quiet moments when the world was watching, actions spoke louder than the unspoken prejudices lingering just beneath the surface. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had started as quiet concern now buzzed with tension, a low hum of unease that seemed to ripple through the rows of passengers. David Carter, calm and focused, continued his work, monitoring the elderly passenger's condition with practiced precision. The nurse returned with the medical kit, her movements quick but steady. She handed it to David without hesitation, her trust in him apparent. They worked in quiet coordination, the nurse following David's instructions while the elderly man's wife clutched his hand, her face lined with worry. Then, as if on cue, the turbulence of human assumptions made itself known. "Excuse me," a voice cut through the tense silence. The flight attendant, the same one who had hesitated earlier, now stood stiffly a few feet away. Her expression was composed, but her tone betrayed a hint of unease. I think we need to confirm your qualifications before you continue. David paused, his hands still as he looked up at her. For a moment, the hum of the engines seemed louder, filling the space between them. My qualifications? He asked. His voice measured, as if clarifying an instruction in the cockpit. Yes, she said, folding her arms. Her eyes flicked to the nurse as if seeking support. But the nurse kept her focus on the patient. I just want to make sure you're trained to handle this. David took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew this dance, the unspoken rhythm of doubt that followed him. No matter the situation, the facts didn't matter, his years of training, his spotless record as a pilot. What mattered to people like her was the part of him he couldn't change. The part that too often came before everything else. I'm certified in emergency medical procedures. He replied evenly. I'm also a licensed pilot. I've handled situations like this before. The words hung in the air, simple and straightforward, but they did little to soften her expression. She shifted her weight, glancing at the other passengers who were now watching intently. The tension in her body spoke louder than anything she could have said. David returned his attention to the elderly man. The pulse was still faint, but steady. He adjusted the man's position slightly, speaking calmly to the wife, who nodded through her tears. Shouldn't we wait for someone else? The flight attendant pressed, her voice low but persistent. Maybe there's someone with, she hesitated, searching for the right word. More specific expertise. It was subtle, the way her words framed the moment. She wasn't outright questioning him. Not explicitly. Instead, it was the kind of doubt that cloaked itself in politeness. A veneer of concern thin enough to see through. The nurse straightened, her voice cutting cleanly into the tension. He knows what he's doing, she said firmly. Right now, he's the most qualified person to help. We need to focus on the passenger. The flight attendant's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She lingered for another moment before stepping back, her reluctance evident. David didn't watch her go. He couldn't afford to. The elderly man needed his full attention. And so did the wife, whose trembling hands clung to her husband as if her grip alone could keep him tethered. I need you to stay calm, David said gently, his voice low enough to be heard over the murmur of the cabin. We're doing everything we can. And he's responding. The wife nodded, her breath hitching as she wiped her eyes. David felt the weight of her hope, fragile and desperate, resting on him like a physical burden. It was a weight he was used to carrying, even when others doubted he could. The cabin was still, except for the occasional rustle of a passenger shifting uncomfortably in their seat. David could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and unease. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. Their stares were as familiar as the turbulence that sometimes rocked the planes he piloted unexpected. But manageable. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with the responsibility of the moment. David and the nurse worked in sync, their focus unwavering. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the elderly man's breathing grew steadier, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that promised hope. David sat back, exhaling quietly. The nurse met his eyes and nodded, her expression softening into relief. Good work, she said. David didn't reply immediately. He let the moment settle, his gaze flicking briefly to the flight attendant who now stood further away, her posture stiff and guarded. She wasn't looking at him, her attention fixed on the window as though trying to escape the reality of what had just unfolded. It wasn't the first time David had been doubted in a moment of crisis. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. But here, in the quiet hum of the cabin, he let the questions and assumptions fall away. What mattered now was that a life had been steadied, even if the undercurrent of doubt lingered like an invisible passenger. For David, that was enough. It had to be. The elderly man's breathing had steadied, a shallow but discernible rhythm that brought a moment of relief to those watching. The tension in the cabin eased slightly, but it didn't dissipate entirely. Instead, it lingered in the air like a faint turbulence unseen but felt by everyone. David Carter remained by the man's side, monitoring his condition with quiet focus. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who knew what he was doing. Yet he was keenly aware of the unspoken questions that still swirled around him. The passengers had relaxed enough to return to their seats. But their glances in his direction lingered. Some curious, others uncertain. The flight attendant who had questioned him earlier approached again. This time with a faintly forced smile. Her voice was polite, but it carried an undercurrent of discomfort. "We've contacted ground control," she said. "They're coordinating with medical teams to meet us when we land. Thank you for your help so far." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good to hear," he replied evenly. His focus remained on the elderly man, who was now stirring slightly, his eyelids fluttering as if trying to wake. The flight attendant hesitated, as though weighing her next words. Finally, she added, "If there's anything else we need, we'll let you know. For now, we've got it under control." David glanced up at her. The faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Disbelief? Resignation? It was hard to tell. "I'll stay here until we're sure he's stable," he said. His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the firmness in his words. She nodded quickly, retreating a step before moving back up the aisle. David watched her go for a moment before returning his attention to the patient. The nurse, who had been quietly assisting, leaned closer, her voice low. "You handled that well," she said. "Better than I would have." David allowed himself a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You learn to pick your battles," he said simply. The nurse didn't respond, but her expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. As the minutes ticked by, the elderly man grew more alert. His wife clutched his hand, her relief evident as he murmured her name weakly. David guided her through simple steps to keep him comfortable, his voice steady and reassuring. The cabin had grown quieter again, the passengers settling into a subdued calm. But David knew the moment wasn't entirely behind them. The sense of unease hadn't disappeared, it had only shifted. Like a cloud drifting across an otherwise clear sky. He could feel it in the way the flight crew moved, efficient, professional, but avoiding his gaze. He could sense it in the passengers, their sidelong glances and hushed conversations. It was an old dance, one he knew well. People didn't need to say anything for their thoughts to be clear. The questions hung in the air, unspoken but present. Who is he to take charge? Can we trust him? Why didn't anyone else step forward? David didn't need their approval, but he couldn't ignore the weight of it either. He had seen it before, this careful balancing act of proving himself without appearing to try, of offering help without overstepping invisible boundaries. The elderly man's wife touched David's arm lightly, pulling him from his thoughts. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved his life." David met her gaze and nodded. "I'm glad I could help," he said simply. Her gratitude was genuine, but he could feel the ripple of tension still running through the cabin. It wasn't about what he had done, it was about who had done it. The nurse had been accepted without question, David had not. The irony wasn't lost on him. If he had been wearing his pilot's uniform, there would have been no hesitation, no need to explain himself. But here, in plain clothes, he was just another man, a man whose competence was measured against assumptions before it was measured by his actions. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent. The flight was nearing its end, but David knew the echoes of this moment would linger. Not just for him, but for everyone who had watched it unfold. As the plane began its gradual descent, he leaned back slightly, his work done for now. He let his gaze drift to the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly, indifferent to the human complexities playing out beneath them. There was no victory in this moment, no sense of triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of having done what needed to be done. Even in the face of doubt, David closed his eyes briefly, centering himself as the plane moved closer to the ground. Sometimes, he thought, the most important battles weren't the ones fought out loud. They were the quiet ones, waged in the space between assumptions and reality, where change often began not with a roar, but with a whisper. The plane descended through thin layers of cloud, the soft turbulence causing the cabin to sway gently. It wasn't unusual, nothing out of the ordinary for seasoned travelers. But the atmosphere inside the plane remained taut, charged with a tension that had little to do with the altitude. David Carter sat quietly now, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed out the window. The elderly passenger he had helped was stable, leaning against his wife, who held his hand tightly. Relief had softened the lines on her face. But she glanced at David from time to time with an expression that was more than gratitude. It was something closer to awe, a realization of how close they had come to losing everything. The flight attendant from earlier stood at the front of the cabin. Her clipboard held like a shield. She avoided David's eyes, addressing the other crew members with hushed urgency. Her posture betrayed her unease, as though she was still processing her own role in the day's events. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its final approach. Around David, passengers shifted in their seats, fastening seatbelts and tucking away books and devices. Conversations were subdued, murmured just above the hum of the engines. But David could feel their weight. He wasn't looking for their approval, he never had, but he was acutely aware of the undercurrent of scrutiny. The nurse who had worked alongside him leaned over briefly, her voice quiet. "He's going to be okay. Thanks to you." David gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "We both did our part," he said, his tone measured. She studied him for a moment, as though trying to understand the calm exterior he projected. "Not everyone would have stepped up the way you did," she said. "Even fewer could have handled the doubt you faced." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drift back to the window, where the lights of the city below flickered like tiny stars. "You get used to it," he said finally, his voice low. "Doesn't mean it gets easier." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but weighted. The nurse nodded, her respect for him evident. But she didn't press further. She returned to her seat, leaving David with his thoughts. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the airport. He spoke with the calm authority that David recognized instantly, a tone meant to reassure passengers even in moments of uncertainty. It was a voice David had used countless times in his own career. Though today he sat among those who listened instead of leading. As the plane began its final descent, the flight attendant approached him once more. Her smile was small, tentative, as though she wasn't sure how to begin. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. "For stepping in." David met her gaze, his expression steady. "You're welcome," he said simply. She lingered, shifting her weight awkwardly. I wasn't sure at first," she admitted, her words stumbling over themselves. "But you proved me wrong. And I'm sorry for doubting you." It was an apology, of sorts, though it felt more like an attempt to reconcile what she thought she knew with what she had seen. David didn't begrudge her the effort. But he didn't let her off the hook either. "It's not about proving people wrong," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It's about doing what's needed, whether they see it or not." She nodded, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. "Still," she said softly, "I'm glad you were here." David watched her return to her station, her shoulders a little less stiff than before. It wasn't much, but it was something. A step, perhaps, in the long and quiet journey of confronting assumptions. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle thud, and the cabin erupted in polite applause, a tradition more habit than genuine gratitude. For David, it was a familiar sound, one he had heard countless times from the other side of the cockpit door. This time, it carried a different weight. As the plane taxied to the gate, David felt the shift in the passengers around him. Their glances were no longer wary, but curious, respectful, even. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it was something closer to acknowledgement, a recognition of the man who had sat among them, quiet and steady, and saved a life without seeking attention or approval. David gathered his belongings as the passengers began to disembark. The elderly man's wife stopped him before he could leave, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you again," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll never forget what you did." David gave her a small smile, his voice soft. "Take care of him," he said. "That's what matters." He moved through the aisle with the practiced ease of someone used to navigating tight spaces. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the weight of the day settle over him, a mix of quiet satisfaction and the familiar ache of knowing that, even now, some doubts would linger. But as the cool air of the terminal enveloped him, David allowed himself a small moment of peace. He had done what needed to be done. And sometimes, in the face of doubt, That was enough. The terminal bustled with the subdued energy of passengers moving on to the next leg of their journey. David Carter lingered near a window, watching the plane he had just disembarked as it was tended to by the ground crew. The rhythmic motions of luggage carts and fuel hoses brought a strange comfort. A reminder of the precision and teamwork he had always loved about aviation. Behind him, the passengers from the flight were dispersing, their murmurs blending into the larger hum of the airport. He caught fragments of their conversations, their tones still tinged with the emotional residue of the flight. Thank goodness he was there. Can you believe how calm he was? I didn't even realize he was a pilot. The words weren't directed at him, but they reached him all the same, carried on the invisible thread that connected him to the events they had just lived through. He didn't turn around. Praise, curiosity, and skepticism often sounded the same from a distance. The sliding doors of the terminal hissed open and shut, letting in gusts of cool air that carried with them the faint smell of rain. David checked his watch, noting the time with the precision that was second nature. His next connection wasn't for hours, leaving him more time than he wanted to replay the flight in his mind. Excuse me, Mr. Carter? The voice was hesitant, and when David turned, he saw the flight attendant standing a few feet away. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her posture almost contrite. Up close, she looked younger than he had realized, her professionalism slightly frayed at the edges. I'm sorry to bother you, she said quickly, as though afraid he might walk away. I wanted to say thank you. Again, for everything you did back there. David regarded her for a moment, his expression steady. You're welcome, he said simply. His tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was measured, careful, the way he had learned to speak in moments like these. She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I also wanted to apologize, she added, for earlier. I didn't realize you were a pilot. I should have trusted you sooner. David didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang between them, their weight heavier than she might have intended. He could see her discomfort, the way she struggled to bridge the gap between her assumptions and the reality she had been forced to confront. I appreciate the apology, he said at last. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was a firmness beneath it. But it's not about whether or not I'm a pilot. It's about recognizing that help can come from unexpected places and not letting assumptions get in the way of that. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. You're right, she said quietly. I think I still have a lot to learn. David allowed himself a small smile, though it carried a hint of sadness. We all do, he said. The important thing is being willing to learn. The flight attendant looked as though she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she extended her hand, a gesture that was as much an offering as it was an acknowledgement. David shook it, his grip firm but brief. As she walked away, David turned back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass. The rain had started now, a light drizzle that blurred the edges of the runway lights. He watched as another plane taxied to its gate, its engines rumbling softly in the distance. He thought about the flight, about the passengers who had thanked him and the ones who had only watched from afar. He thought about the elderly man, now likely in the care of medical professionals, and the wife who had clung to hope so fiercely. And he thought about the moments of doubt, the hesitation in people's eyes when they looked at him not knowing who he was, but thinking they did. It wasn't anger he felt. Not anymore. It was something quieter, deeper, a kind of weariness that came from knowing how far the world still had to go. But there was also a flicker of hope, faint but persistent, in the apology he had just received and the respect he had earned. Even if it had come late. The rain streaked the window, the droplets racing each other down the glass. David let out a slow breath, his reflection fading as he stepped back and prepared to move on. Sometimes, clarity didn't come all at once. It arrived in small, quiet moments, in the apology of a flight attendant, in the grateful eyes of a passenger, in the simple act of standing firm against assumptions. And for David, those moments were enough to remind him why he kept going, why he continued to step forward even when the world hesitated to meet him halfway. The flight had landed hours ago, but the echoes of the journey lingered. David Carter found himself in the quiet corner of a bustling airport coffee shop. a steaming cup resting between his hands. Outside, planes taxied on the rain-slicked tarmac, their engines humming in a rhythm he had always found soothing. The storm that had threatened the skies earlier was clearing, leaving a pale gray canvas over the horizon. The world moved on, as it always did, yet David sat still, reflecting on the events of the day with the detached clarity of someone who had weathered such moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. But this time had felt different. Perhaps because of how openly the doubts had been expressed, not in words, but in glances, in hesitation, in the way decisions had been delayed when urgency had demanded otherwise. As he sipped his coffee, the nurse from the flight approached. She carried a small bag slung over her shoulder, her pace unhurried yet deliberate. When she reached his table, she offered a warm smile and gestured to the seat across from him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. David nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Please." She set her bag on the floor and settled into the chair, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "I wanted to say goodbye before my connection," she said, "and to thank you again." David inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words. "You did just as much as I did," he said. "It wasn't a one-person effort." The nurse smiled, but it was tinged with something deeper in understanding they both shared. "Maybe," she said, "but you were the one who stepped forward first. And you kept going, even when others hesitated." David shrugged lightly, his hands cradling the warm ceramic mug. "You do what needs to be done," he said. "That's what matters." She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've been a nurse for a long time," she said, "and I've seen people hesitate not because they lack the skill, but because they're afraid of how others will perceive them. It's a kind of fear that doesn't always make sense to everyone. But it's real." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he traced the rim of the cup with his thumb, his gaze distant. "It's not fear," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's calculation. You weigh the risks not of failure, but of being doubted, of stepping forward and having to prove yourself before you can even begin to help." The nurse nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "And yet you did it," she said, "even knowing what it would cost." David met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Some things are worth the cost," he said. "A life is always worth it." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the noise of the airport bustling around them. When the nurse stood to leave, she hesitated, her hand resting lightly on the table. "I hope you know you made a difference today," she said, "not just for that man and his wife, but for everyone who was watching." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, "time will tell." As she walked away, David let out a slow breath, his mind returning to the flight and the moments that had unfolded like a quiet storm. The tension, the hesitation, the eventual clarity, it all felt like a familiar pattern, one he had navigated countless times before. But there had been a shift, however small: the apology from the flight attendant, the gratitude of the passengers, the respect in the nurse's eyes. It wasn't enough to erase the doubts, but it was enough to remind him that change, however slow, was possible. He finished his coffee and stood, gathering his belongings as the announcement for his next flight crackled over the speakers. As he walked toward the gate, the world around him seemed a little lighter, the rain now a faint memory against the clearing sky. Sometimes, reconciliation didn't come in grand gestures or sweeping changes. Sometimes, it came in the quiet moments, in an apology, in a shared understanding, in the simple act of standing firm in the face of doubt. And for David, that was enough to keep moving forward. The evening sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the bustling airport terminal. David Carter moved through the crowded concourse, his steps unhurried yet purposeful. The events of the day had settled over him like a soft haze, neither heavy nor light, but present in a way that refused to be ignored. He stopped by a row of chairs near his gate, setting down his carry-on and taking a moment to sit. Around him, the world carried on as it always did, families reunited with embraces. Business travelers hurried to their connections, and announcements droned overhead, marking the passage of time. David allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The flight had been just one among thousands that crisscrossed the skies daily. A single thread in the vast fabric of human movement. Yet, for those on board, it had been anything but ordinary. Lives had intersected in ways they hadn't expected. And assumptions had been challenged in ways they hadn't prepared for. From his seat, David noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was the elderly man's wife. Her pace slow but deliberate. When she reached him, she paused, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of her purse. "I was hoping I'd find you," she said, her voice soft but steady. David stood, meeting her gaze. She looked tired, the day's strain etched into the lines of her face. But there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to thank you again," she continued, "not just for saving my husband, but for how you handled everything. You didn't have to step in. But you did. And you didn't let anything stop you." David nodded, his face calm. "I'm glad I could help," he said. "That's what matters." She hesitated, then added, I think you showed us all something today. About courage. About not letting the way things are stop us from seeing how they could be." Her words were quiet, almost tentative, but David could hear the sincerity in them. They weren't just about gratitude, they were about understanding. However small, that something deeper had shifted during that flight. "Thank you for saying that," David replied. "It means a lot." The woman nodded, her eyes misting slightly. "I hope you know you made a difference," she said. "Not just for us, but for everyone who saw what you did." David watched as she walked away, her shoulders a little straighter than before. Her words lingered, filling the space she left behind. They weren't a resolution, not entirely, but they were a step forward. And that was enough for now. As he turned back to his seat, David noticed a group of passengers from the flight gathered near another gate. Their faces lit up with recognition when they saw him. A man raised a hand in a small wave, and others nodded, their expressions a mix of respect and quiet acknowledgement. David returned the gesture, a faint smile touching his lips. He didn't need their applause or their admiration, but the recognition felt like a quiet victory, not for him alone, but for what the moment had represented. It wasn't a resolution to the larger questions that still loomed in the world, but it was a reminder that even small moments of understanding could matter. As his boarding call echoed through the terminal, David stood, shouldering his bag. The sun outside had dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose. He moved toward the gate, his steps steady, his mind calm. The world hadn't changed in the span of a single flight, but something had shifted. In the quiet moments of doubt and courage, in the apologies and realizations, there had been a glimpse of what was possible, a world where assumptions could be challenged and connections could be forged. David stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the engines growing louder as he approached the plane. He didn't know what the next flight would bring, but as he crossed the threshold and found his seat, he carried with him the quiet certainty that he would meet it with the same resolve. The plane began its ascent, the ground falling away beneath him, and David let out a slow breath. Above the clouds, where the sky stretched endlessly, the divisions and assumptions of the world below seemed small, almost insignificant, and yet, he knew they mattered. It was why he kept going, why he kept stepping forward, even when the world hesitated to follow. As the plane leveled out, David closed his eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines lull him into a quiet calm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own questions, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Above the clouds, carried forward by the unseen currents of the sky, he felt a quiet hope take root, a small, steady reminder that even in the face of doubt, change was possible.